Good evening, all, and welcome back to Introduction to Philosophy. Tonight, we are talking about the influences of Islam on Western philosophy and also on the medieval era. So let's just jump right into it. So we're starting in about 632 AD, and in Saudi Arabia, you have, or what would become Saudi Arabia, you've got the Prophet Muhammad having revealed to him a divine message, which is going to be recorded in the Quran. So Islam is founded. Now, what do we get from that? Well, we get some interesting stuff because what the divine message itself says is that a flourishing, rich, and intellectual life is a godly life. So kind of getting that same idea that we got from Aristotle. And so the Islamic faith, as it's presented in the Quran, is at once kind of a culture, an ethics, a mode of philosophical inquiry, and also a commitment to what might be called a more reflective life. So had it not been for some of these Islamic scholars, especially of the 9th and 11th centuries, the West probably would not have gotten back, how did they lose it, but would not have gotten back their Aristotelian and Platonic canon. So 632 is largely a dark age in the West, so-called because there's not a whole lot of new philosophical thought taking place. There's not a lot of scientific thought taking place. Really, the West is recovering from the collapse of the Roman Empire in 476. They're sort of getting their feet back. They've got all these Vandals and Moors and Saracens and all of these various groups trying to attack and invade them. And so we're kind of inclined to call this period from about 650 to 850. Some people would extend it up to the year 1000 just for a nice round sum. Some people a little less. But anyway, we call this a dark age. And there's not a whole lot of thought until we get to the Scholastic Age, which we're going to be tackling pretty soon here. So one of the main reasons for this is that the Western communities is almost entirely under attack during this time. The Mediterranean Sea, which is really kind of the only way in or out of that area that surrounds Italy and Greece and so on and so forth, is under Islamic control. And so they're not letting people in through that Strait of Gibraltar or down through the Bosporus to get into there. Also, excuse me, the papyrus, the paper that they used, was forbidden from exporting. So we're going to start to see the introduction of vellum and things like that. Now you've got these Vandals, Moors, Saracens, the Gothic tribes, the collapse of Rome, the break of all political institutions, and it kind of makes this quasi-nomadic culture where people are really more concerned with staying alive for another day than sitting down and doing any serious philosophy. Now in the Eastern world at this time is kind of going great guns. So if you recall your history, the Western Roman Empire, that's, Rome, that's the one that we're accustomed to studying, and that's Julius Caesar and fighting with the Gauls and all that kind of stuff. When you get a guy named Constantine who comes along in about 325, he sets up the Eastern Roman Empire. Difference is Western largely Latin speaking, Eastern largely Greek speaking. The West would become Roman Catholic, the Greek would remain Eastern Orthodox, the East would remain Eastern Orthodox, hence the name. But when the West collapses, the East keeps going strong. In fact, until the Ottoman Turks toppled Constantinople in 1453 with the use of the fairly recent invention of the cannon, the East was there and had all this Greek knowledge, all of the Plato, all of the Aristotle, and so on, that had been so long gone in the West that they didn't know they had ever lost it. By the time Islam is militarily successful to occupy the Byzantine world, it's got all of the stuff that we've been talking about this semester. All of the Greek medicine, all the Greek theater, all the Greek mathematics, all the Greek philosophy, which is why we are interested in it. So in about the 10th century, you get a guy named Al-Farabi coming along, and he's interested in Plato's Republic. And what he says is, well, Plato is on the right track. We do need a philosopher king, but being a Muslim, we also need one who's going to be a prophet to have the best possible leadership. So very early on within Islam, there's this tendency, and we can kind of see this reading chronologically through stuff, that all political, naturalistic, scientific, all of that kind of thinking has got to be looked at through the lens of the Quran. And that to reject that is to be an infidel, which just means an unbeliever, okay? But there's still kind of this independent philosophical thought taking place within Islam. In the 10th and 11th centuries, we start to see philosophy as kind of this growing core interest of Islamic commentators, and they're interested primarily on Greco-Roman sources. So there's this idea that inquiry can be developed even while holding theology as a constant. So Al-Farabi comes back again, And what he's going to ultimately try and do is attempt, and I don't know that he's entirely successful with this, to reconcile Aristotelian and Platonic thought. Kind of wants to get these guys who didn't get along well in life and get them to get along well, at least with their readings. If we fast forward a little bit, we've got a guy named Avicenna coming along. And keep in mind, all of these names, they're not exactly, they're what they're known as in the West, in the modern world. But these probably would not have been recognizable to the men themselves, with the possible exception of Al-Farabi. So Avicenna is just what we call him, not what we would have called himself. And forgive me, for whatever reason, I can't think of what his actual name was right now. But Avicenna is interested in Aristotle's metaphysics, specifically that causal approach. Remember where we've got the formal, the material, the efficient, and the final cause of things in order to better know the thing. And he's looking at this, that really philosophical justification argues on behalf of a universe that's ordered at the level of matter. So we've got to get that material stuff. Now, Avicenna is going to explain that, or extend that rather, to both the spiritual as well as the civic life. Avicenna's commentaries on Aristotle really kind of put Arabic scholarship and Islamic thought at the center of scientific thinking for a little while, because ultimately it's them that gets the West back on track with these things. So by the early 11th and 12th centuries, the East and West are divided into intellectually warring camps. In 1054, the Eastern Orthodox Church is anathematized and left basically by the Roman Catholic Church. So the Romans say, you're excommunicated. And they go, yeah, well, you're excommunicated. Kind of like, you can't fire me, I quit. That sort of thing. Now, both of these camps, these warring camps, so to speak, are going to use Greek philosophy as a means of validating their positions. And so what we get is this wonderfully rich interpretive exercise as to what Aristotle really meant, what Plato really meant. Where are we going to get prophetic insights or experience or reason? How is this all going to come together, and what can we claim to know? So the cool thing about this is they didn't have Facebook, they didn't have Twitter, they didn't have Instagram. Sorry, you're hearing my cat in the background. But what they did have was scrolls and ink and lots of time on their hands. And so what they would do is they would write back and forth to each other on these matters of theology, philosophy, politics, and what have you. And so we've got this wonderful body, this veritable library, really, of all of their positions and how they would argue that their position was correct. Now, at this point, really in both cultures, philosophical positions start to get judged as heresies. Heresy and heretic come from the Greek heretikos, which means a choice. And so you either believe the right thing or you choose to believe something else. And there are hundreds of heresies, both in the early church, heresies that are found in Islam and so on. And so now wrong interpretations of philosophical positions can actually be considered an offense against the religion. Now, as the Christian church is solidifying its position, politically, economically, socially, it's also going to be doing battle with these heresies. And it's kind of an inevitable sequence of events, really. When a religion, any religion, this doesn't matter if you're a Sikh, a Jew, a Buddhist, a Muslim, whatever, a religion solidifies its position when it develops an official canon of belief. We call this process canonization. So now we've got a body of knowledge that can be taught to the faithful, and the faithful are whoever are obedient to those teachings, okay? Now, once those positions get solidified, though, and burdens are imposed on those who aren't prepared to accept their validity, the philosophical program is going to stall. For the simple reason being that you can't inquire if it's a dangerous situation in which to do so, okay? So as we've got these writers of the East and the West, you know, the West is taking on both Islam, but also Eastern Orthodox Christianity, you've got these debates that are breaking out that are wonderfully informative. And as we're going to see in a later lecture on the European and American witch panics, certain forms of now misconduct take on a much darker new color. People start to say, hey, this is sinister, which just means left-handed, by the way, or even satanic causes. And that really doesn't become the case in the Eastern Orthodox world or in the Muslim world. So this tension between Islam and Christianity, coupled with the recovery of Greek thought, is really going to get the long debate, our problems of knowledge, of conduct, and governance, back on track. One of the things that helps this, well, two things really helped it. One, you've got Muslim incursions into the north of Africa. So if you pull up a map of that part of the world, you've got the Horn of, or I'm sorry, not the Horn of Africa, that's actually down there. But you've got the top of Africa and you've got the bottom of Spain. And across there is that Strait of Gibraltar, the only way, aside from the Bosphorus and the Black Sea, into the Mediterranean. So the Muslims are going to move across the top of Africa and actually go across the Strait of Gibraltar into Spain. As they go with them, they are taking all of this information, all of this Greek and Latin stuff that they've written on, they've translated, they've adapted for a belief in one God, and so on. At the same time, you've also got the Crusaders going the other way. Now, there are typically 4 major crusades that are recognized by scholars, and they are originally titled the first, the second, the third, and the fourth. Wow, how original. There are as many as 8, though, if you start to consider things like the Hermit's Crusade, Peter's Crusade, the Children's Crusade, and so on and so forth. Now, they're going down to the Holy Land, so to Jerusalem, and they're also bringing back this stuff. And what's happening is it's been adapted for belief in one God, it has been commented on, and it's been translated. And so they're actually getting stuff that has gone from Greek to Arabic to Latin to whatever language they happen to speak. Frequently it was Latin. So the long debate, our knowledge of conduct, conduct, and governance, this is the stuff that gets kind of set aside as Christianity starts to re-solidify its religious position. And here we get the concept of orthodoxy. Small o orthodoxy, not like Eastern Orthodox, which is big O. So ortho means straight, right, correct. Like an orthodontist straightens your teeth, okay? Doxis, same root word as doctor, just means to teach or to present, to know a lot about. So right, straight, or correct belief is orthodoxy. And orthodoxy in the small o sense is a big opponent of debate because it says, look, we know what we know is right, the end. And so we start to see some of that old anti-intellectualism of the early church fathers creeping back. We also see some social ambitions within the Roman Catholic world as it's trying to kind of recreate society. So if we think back to Augustine, he's got that idea that, well, reason is useful, faith is paramount, the most important thing that we do. And so combining these things together is really going to give us some kind of fundamentalist religious conviction that's openly hostile to debate. That if not a heresy, debate is at least an insult to the faithful and to the faith that they hold. So by the time we get back to the long debate, the idea has just gotten more problematic. Now it's, what is the best route to truth? And how do we get knowledge? Is knowledge from pure reason? Immanuel Kant will tell us that. Is it from intuition? I just got a gut feeling. Is it from my faith? I believe these things are true. Is it by revelation? God or the gods told me it was true. Or is it some kind of naturalistic empirical observation? So before we had reason and empiricism, or rationality and empiricism, now we've added all of these other things to it. We've made it really kind of a convoluted system. Now the same question is going to be addressed to our ethical or our moral concerns, our problem of conduct. And there's going to be problems. There's going to be severe stumbling blocks. So there's always going to be this pressure against sustaining the long debate, but the contemplative life of the Quran requires of the faithful is entirely compatible with the sustained inquiry. In fact, this is really what's going to give rise more than anything else, to the scholastic age in Western civilization that we'll be talking about soon. So what does Islam contribute? Basically, there might be more than one book of truth, might be more than one set of divine prophecies, might be more than one language used to express thanks to God, and there might be more than one culture that could ground a good spiritual life. So really it's sort of giving us some food for thought as much as anything. So now what we're going to do is kind of switch gears, and we're going to talk about the Middle Ages. Now, I'm going to apologize. This is kind of a mishmash, and I'm going to be jumping around a lot because this is basically 3 large topics that I've smushed together to make this one lecture. So really where we're kind of starting our story for this part is with Charlemagne. So Charlemagne's around for 742 to about 814, and he is going to unite the West really for the first time since the fall of Rome. Let me see if I can pause this. Sorry about that, y'all. My cat was insistent that she had to go outside and harass the chickens, and she would not take no for an answer. So with Charlemagne, we're seeing this guy that for the first time, I mean, he's a warlord, make no mistake, But he decides that he can be a statesman and accomplish more by kind of persuading people and political maneuvering than just by outright battle. So one of the things that Charlemagne is going to do that is unique is he's focusing on the needs of the poor and the protection of the church. His kingdom is divided up into counties, much like our states are. Each jurisdiction has a bishop and has a mayor, so has a sacred and a secular authority. And he's got emissaries from his court that kind of run back and forth. So he's kept very well informed about what's going on in his kingdom. Now, we know that one of Charlemagne's edicts required abbey schools. So like Downton Abbey. No, an abbey was a place where monks lived. We might more commonly say a monastery, but the abbot is still the person in charge of them. And the biggest thing that these abbey schools were tasked with doing was teaching people how to read and write. Although there's some pretty good evidence that Charlemagne himself never mastered writing either. Now, if you were to go into your word processing software, you could probably select a font called Carolingian. That is named after Charlemagne. The whole idea behind Carolingian is it's a standardized font. So, for instance, in Old English, we've got some weird letters. There's one that looks kind of like a D with a couple slashes through it. There's one that literally looks like a thorn and is called thorn. Both of these were pronounced TH, and we really don't see those anymore. Charlemagne said, okay, we're getting rid of all the weird letters. Everybody's going to use this alphabet so we can all read it. That's one of his unique things. And he was an incredible military leader, personally led more than 50 campaigns, which is really pretty impressive, and Christianized a lot of Western Europe, which by and large, fair chunks of it were still pretty pagan. One of the things he did is he said, okay, if you want to own property, you owe me military service. Something very similar to what modern day Israel and Switzerland and a couple of other places do. The idea being you got a little bit of skin in the game. You value it because you have actually had to work and fight for it. So in the later years of his reign, there's little evidence that Charlemagne's rule was punctuated by any military things. He didn't have to fight anymore. And what he did was able to get all of these people together. So if we think about Western Europe, and this kind of goes, so that would be all of Denmark, that's going to be all of Germany, all of France, a pretty good chunk of Italy, kind of down into modern day Spain, maybe Portugal. And you've got a lot of diverse people speaking a lot of very different languages, and Charlemagne is able to unify them really through skill and good planning. So on the 28th of November, the year 800, Charlemagne kneels before Pope Leo III and permits him to crown him emperor. Now that's an important thing. We think today of popes as popular figures and fairly powerful in the grand scheme of things, but in this day, a lot of the popes didn't live very long, and they spent most of their time kind of running from place to place, trying not to be killed or ransomed or what have you. So Charlemagne is kind of giving him this extra bit of office. Now what he establishes is what is called the Holy Roman Empire. If you read Voltaire, who we'll be talking about in a couple of weeks when we get to the French philosophes, he says the Holy Roman Empire was neither holy, nor was it Roman, run by a German guy or a French guy, and it really wasn't much of an empire either. But what it did was kind of pull together all of these loose principalities and tribal chiefdoms, and it put it into something fairly recognizable as a unity. Now, as he's doing this, he's also establishing rule on a royal and religious basis. So this is where we get that idea of divine right of kings. Who put me in charge? God put me in charge. If you fight me, you're not just fighting me, you're fighting God, and you don't want to do that. So Charlemagne is ruling with the authority of this hegemonic Catholic Church, which is starting to articulate its canonical teachings, and he's basing a lot of his rule on the teachings of the church, and in turn, influencing a lot of the church based on his rule. And so he's doing quite a bit to join these together. Now, Charlemagne would also unite the West further by instruction, by really pretty generous laws, and by the fuller participation of the church in daily life. If we go to towns that are from this era, and of course, if you go to Europe, you can see a number of these, smack dab in the middle of the town are two things usually, the well and the church. Why? Because you wanted everybody to come to that central area, and they would have to do that for both of those reasons. Now, one of the things that he does to kind of build cohesion among people is he makes the official language of everything that would take place in the empire Latin, okay? If you wanted to do business in the court, if you wanted to write a legal document, if you had any transactions involving property, it all had to be conducted in Latin, which is really kind of bright of him because, you know, if you're a Spanish speaker and I'm a French speaker or vice versa, we might find some cognates, we might be able to eke out a bit of a conversation, but it's not going to go nearly as smoothly than if we're just writing in the same language, even if we pronounce it a little bit different. And those Romance languages, named for the Romans, are because they share this common root of Latin. But even then, you know, there was Proto-Spanish, Proto-French, a lost language called Occitan, all kinds of things. He says, nope, we're not doing that. We're all doing Latin, and in this Carolingian font. He sends for a teacher from Britain, a guy named St. Alcuin of York, who is going to come to be a very influential scholar in the Western world. Alcuin had already set up York's library in England. He meets Charlemagne on a visit to Rome, and Charlemagne says, hey, come on over here and teach for me. Now, one of the things that he does is he starts by teaching the clergy, the priests, the deacons, and so on, because to a great extent, up until now, they really hadn't been particularly educated. It was kind of, if you were the last son, okay, you're the one that gets to be a priest, go start reading Bibles, or manage to memorize them so that you can give a decent homily every once in a while. But mainly they had a basic function. Now Alcuin says, nope, you're going to be teachers. And it has this very viral spread. One guy can teach 10 people who can teach 10 people, and before you know it, you've got a country educated. He really managed to raise the literacy rate pretty exponentially during his time there, okay? So by the time Alcuin dies, you've got schools all over the place, and this vast empire is mainly staffed by his former students. You've got guys like the Irish monks over in Iona. What they're doing is slowly putting together this classical core curriculum, which is kind of where we get it from, almost directly. This idea, Alcuin was a Latinist and a classicist, and he said, look, we've got to build this culture of learning. And these core liberal arts, what they're really going to do is prepare the clergy that will then instruct everybody else. So he comes up first with what's called the trivium, try 3, okay? These are grammar, rhetoric, and logic. Grammar, how to write good sentences in Latin. Rhetoric, how to speak cleverly in Latin. And logic, how to make good, solid arguments where valid premises go to valid conclusions, you guessed it, in Latin. After a while, that's going to be added to. By about the 12th century, we see 7 subjects because we've added the quadrivium: arithmetic, music, geometry, and astronomy. Now, music, that might seem kind of a strange one, but music in this case was really a little bit closer to what we would call physics. So you're getting things in there that are a really pretty well-rounded education, all things considered. Later on, they would add theology, they would add philosophy, they would sometimes add astrology, not the best idea perhaps, but this would expand it out to about 10 major liberal arts. From these abbey schools, you're going to get this really evolving kind of thing, because generally the easiest place to meet was in a church, and you would go in there and you would hear disquisitions on various topics. And I believe the first instance was in Paris, where all of these students that would assemble to hear lectures called themselves universitas, where we get our word university from. So they're just banding together. These universities are kind of, they're intended at any rate to be, they don't always succeed at this, to foster a life of contemplation. That's a really important thing. Aristotle said this is like the life in the Isles of the Blessed, which is kind of a semi-mythical thing. But the life was religious, it was also critical, it was also rational, it involved doubting and questioning. It was this life of reason that really shaped what we do now. So the original university has a practical mission, educating the clergy, but that's going to extend to everybody else as well. And after a while, we start seeing specialized universities like the University of Paris, Bologna, Salerno, getting law schools, medical schools, and so on. And what they're doing is scholarly. They're listening to disquisitions, which is the fancy way of saying lecture, which is kind of what you're doing now. They're asking questions, which hopefully you're doing in the discussions. They're submitting themselves to examinations, as you will be later on in the course. They're constructing their own glosses of philosophical works, which is exactly what I'm asking you to do in the term paper. And they're doing this all within a community of scholars, each of whom is on a pretty equal moral standing. We get other schools popping up like Oxford. That's going to be very important for us coming up next. And this is really the first time that you start to see a genuinely academic class of philosophers, such as myself. What is my job? My job is to be devoted to a disciplined, systematic form of study, and also to develop your minds as my students. Okay. The other major great achievement of this period is the Gothic Cathedral. There were about 100 of them built between 1150 and 1300, and you go, only 100? Well, yeah, but you might start building a building that your great-grandfather would, you might finish building a building that your great-grandfather had started. These things took a long, long time to build, and they come together in a way that is really kind of interesting. It basically gives this idea of earthly life as sort of this microcosmic metaphor, that you're a small part of a big, big thing. And this is taking place within the feudal system, that, you know, the king would have his barons, and the barons would have their knights, and the knights would have their freemen and their serfs, and everybody was sort of where they belonged. The closest thing that I could compare this to would be the caste system in India, where you've got your Brahmins, your Vaishyas, your Kshatriyas, your Shudras, and your Dalits, where everybody is sort of where they're supposed to be. That system is predicated on karma. The feudal system is predicated on Christianity, but they both kind of work the same way. The serfs, you know, we think it would suck to be a serf, but they had legal rights. They could take their lord to court for abuses. And the lord of the manor has also special duties. The idea is that you are where God wants you to be, and everything that you're doing is for the greater glory of God. Sometimes you'll see on buildings, especially if they're Jesuit buildings, AMDG, Ad Maiorem Dei Gloriam, for the greater glory of God. And that's really what they thought they were accomplishing in this. In the 19th century, a guy named John Ruskin, he was an aesthete, whom we'll talk about more about later. He's writing about the late Renaissance architecture and saying, I don't like it. It's too perfect. All those straight lines and stuff. What I really like, though, is the Gothic. Because if you look at a Gothic cathedral, you know, it's got gargoyles and kind of these wild proportions and flying buttresses and all sorts of cool stuff that really, he says, and I am inclined to think that he's right, really shows off a lot more creativity and imagination. The whole idea of a cathedral is kind of a rhetorical statement. If you go into one, and we don't have any really spectacular ones near here, closest probably San Fernando Cathedral in San Antonio, but it's not that huge. It's to make you feel kind of small and puny, not in relation to other people, but in relation to the divine. So it's supposed to be this big, impressive open space that really just sort of wows your senses. The kind of third great institutional creation coming out of the medieval period is chivalry. This idea that really is sort of the high point of our virtuous conduct. And, you know, chivalry kind of brings to mind, you know, the knight errant, and he's, you know, obsessively well-mannered and jousting and doing all these kind of things, doing whatever daring do to gain the lady's favor. But really, this is just the problem of conduct. The chivalric knight is kind of a secular priest. He's sort of the executive branch of government, sort of out there policing, patrolling, and making sure that everything works well. Right reason is going to take a turn during this time, and we'll start to see some echoes of Plato. Remember, Plato said that the soul, and of course he meant mind, was tripartite. We've got the rational, the passionate, and the emotional. In the Middle Ages, we're going to start to see that associated with the Holy Trinity as well as with the diversity of people. So this Knight's Code kind of becomes this form of nobility through ritualized self-sacrifice. His politeness is symbolized by his strength, because yes, he could cut you down with his sword, but he opts not to. He's got complete control over his motions, which are why he is given the right to seek out justice for people. And really the only insult is an insult to honor. So we're going to see chivalry as kind of one of these subtle background. It's one of the great civilizing influences in the history of Western civilization. It's going to have certain excesses. It's going to have some kind of problems. Some kind of lends itself to comic renditions. If you've never seen it, you need to see Monty Python and the Holy Grail. But in this institution, we're finding a lot of philosophy and a lot of Christianity kind of coming together in an attempt to rebuild the Western world in a way that it was better than before. So this is kind of where we stop off for this evening. Again, I apologize. This was kind of a hodgepodge of stuff that we had to cover, but it sets the stage very importantly for where we're going next. As always, if you have any questions, drop them down in the comments, put them in the discussion on Canvas, and we will address them there. Thank you all for your kind attention, and I'll see you later. Bye-bye.